Imagine this. You're a princess, raised in silks and jewels, your childhood filled with tutors, etiquette lessons, and endless preparation for a marriage you had no choice in. On your wedding night, the world expects you to fulfill your one true duty, to give your husband an heir. But what if you had no privacy? What if your first night as a wife, as a lover, was not your own, but staged, witnessed, even judged? Welcome to the dark world of royal bridal bedroom rules, where intimacy was never about love, but about politics, power, and proof. From medieval France to Victorian England, queens and princesses were not just wives, they were dynastic tools. Their bodies became battlegrounds for alliances, heirs, and legitimacy. And the most personal act of all, sex was twisted into a public ritual, bound by laws and customs so invasive they now feel horrific. You're listening to Whispers of History, where we uncover the secrets the past tried to bury. Subscribe now, because tonight we begin a journey into the royal bedchamber, where desire, duty, and humiliation collided in ways that will shock you. Let's start in France, in the 16th century, where the ritual of the Bedingungsnacht, or bedding ceremony, was an expected part of royal weddings. The bride and groom were led to bed, not in private, but in front of courtiers, clergy, and family. They were undressed, tucked in, and blessed, often with prayers, songs, and drunken laughter. Then the curtains were drawn, and the crowd left, leaving the couple to consummate the marriage. But here's the sinister detail. In many cases, the consummation wasn't trusted to remain private. Witnesses sometimes lingered nearby, listening for sounds, waiting for signs. Sheets were examined the next morning for blood, physical proof that the bride was pure and the marriage legitimate. Imagine the weight on a young girl, barely 16, knowing that her family, her country, and her future all depended on her performance that very night. And this wasn't just France. In Tudor England, the bedding ceremony became a political theatre. When Mary Tudor married Philip of Spain in 1554, nobles escorted the couple into their chamber, formally blessing the bed before departing. The act itself was private, but everyone knew that its success would be judged by whether Mary conceived. Failure meant scandal, and for Mary, who would die childless, it meant whispers of failure that haunted her reign. In Scotland, the practice could be even more invasive. During the 15th and 16th centuries, noble families demanded public proof of consummation. In one notorious case, the wedding night of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, was followed by gossip when no immediate signs of blood appeared. For royal brides, virginity was less a personal state than a political certificate, one they were forced to prove, whether through stained sheets or humiliating examinations. But the horror did not stop at the wedding night. In many courts, bedroom rules became a lifelong sentence. A queen's body was constantly scrutinized. Her menstrual cycles were recorded. Her pregnancies announced only when her swelling belly betrayed her. Even miscarriages became political events, whispered about in foreign courts, blamed on witchcraft, sin, or the queen's supposed failure, the worst of all. In some kingdoms, queens were subjected to the virginity test. Before marriage, an invasive physical examination carried out by matrons or physicians to confirm her purity. If she failed, the marriage could be annulled, alliances destroyed, wars even triggered. One slip of the body could mean the ruin of nations, and if she succeeded, she then faced the terror of proving herself again on her wedding night, under rules that turned her most intimate moment into a political spectacle. Imagine the fear of Marie Antoinette in 1770. A 14-year-old Austrian archduchess sent to France to marry the future Louis XVI. Their wedding night was not a private moment between two frightened teenagers. It was an event the entire court anticipated. When no child appeared for 7 long years, whispers filled Versailles. Was Louis impotent? Was Marie frigid? Or worse, was she unfaithful? Her every move, every expression, every glance at another man was dissected as evidence. Her body was not her own. It belonged to France. This was the brutal truth of royal marriage. It was never about love. It was about heirs. Queens were wombs wrapped in jewels, their intimacy dissected by priests, doctors, and courtiers. And the bedroom was never a sanctuary. It was a stage. Which leaves us with a question. If even queens had no control over their own wedding nights, what hope was there for ordinary women? Picture the scene. A vast bed hung with embroidered curtains, candles flickering in golden holders, courtiers crowding the chamber as though it were a theatre. The bride and groom are stripped to their linen underclothes, prayed over, and tucked in like children. The audience departs, but their judgment lingers, because what happened next would not stay private. It would ripple through courts, dynasties, and even wars. This was the reality for many royal brides across Europe. Their wedding nights were spectacles, their bodies reduced to symbols of purity and power. And when things went wrong, humiliation followed. Consider the marriage of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves in 1540. Henry claimed he could not consummate the union, telling his advisors that she was nothing fair, and found her body in such sort disordered, and without maidenly demeanour, as was to me great displeasure. He spread rumours that her body repelled him, and that he found her unfit for a wife. In truth, it was likely Henry's own impotence and disappointment that doomed the union, but Anne bore the humiliation. The marriage was annulled within months, her supposed failure immortalised in history. Another infamous case comes from Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Their wedding in 1770 was celebrated with fireworks and feasts. But behind the doors of Versailles, the royal couple struggled. Louis, shy and awkward, failed to consummate the marriage for years, whether from physical difficulties or sheer nervousness. Marie Antoinette, barely more than a child, endured relentless scrutiny. The French court whispered about her virginity. Foreign ambassadors reported on her progress, and pamphlets mocked her as Madame Deficit, not only for her spending, but for her supposed inability to bear an heir. When finally, after 7 years, consummation occurred, the event was reported as though it were a matter of state. Their most private act had become Europe's most public gossip. And then there was Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII. Their wedding night in 1509 became a matter of international politics decades later, when Henry sought to annul their marriage. He claimed it was invalid because Catherine had been previously married to his brother Arthur. Catherine insisted that her first marriage had never been consummated, a claim she defended fiercely, even under oath. Her entire honor and England's religious fate rested on the events of a single night she had spent as a teenage bride. The truth may never be known, but the spectacle of her defense shows how a bride's most intimate moments could alter the course of kingdoms. Sometimes the pressure for proof descended into grotesque rituals. In parts of France and Spain, the morning after the wedding, the sheets of the bridal bed were displayed publicly to prove the bride's virginity. If no blood appeared, suspicions of scandal spread quickly. Historians record cases where servants or midwives were ordered to inspect the linen, their reports delivered like evidence in a courtroom. For a bride whose body did not conform to expectations, whose hymen did not tear, or who bled little, the consequences could be ruinous. Innocence was not judged by truth, but by stains. Royal brides were not only judged on consummation, but on fertility. In the 17th and 18th centuries, queens across Europe lived under constant surveillance. Their menstrual cycles were monitored, their appetites noted, their pregnancies announced at the first sign of a missed period. Some were even forced to endure examinations by physicians to confirm whether they were pregnant or not. Their wombs treated as national property. Take Queen Marie de Medici of France, whose pregnancies were reported to the court as though they were state victories. When she miscarried, blame fell upon her personally, whispered about as though she had betrayed her duty. Similarly, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sissy, was pressured relentlessly to produce heirs. her every movement scrutinized for signs of fertility. Her personal desires, her happiness, even her health mattered little compared to the expectation that she provide children. The cruelty of these rules is perhaps best seen in the stories of brides who failed. In Denmark in the 18th century, Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain married King Christian VII. The king, unstable and disinterested, neglected her, leaving her humiliated before the court. When she later took a lover, the scandal exploded into a political crisis, leading to her exile. Her inability to fulfill the rigid expectations of a royal wife, to provide heirs and maintain appearances, destroyed her life. And it wasn't just Europe. Across cultures, royal brides were bound by similar humiliations. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, concubines and queens were watched closely, their sexual lives managed and controlled by eunuchs and palace officials. The idea was always the same. The bride's body did not belong to her, but to the dynasty. For these women, marriage was not romance, but ritual. It was not intimacy, but evidence. Their nights were measured by sheets, their wombs by heirs, their desires silenced beneath crowns. And this raises a haunting question. In a world where queens and princesses were stripped of their privacy and judged for their most intimate acts, what did it mean to love? Could a royal bride ever truly experience desire, or was her body forever trapped in duty's cold embrace? If the stained sheets and whispered gossip of the court were not enough, royal brides faced something even more terrifying. The cold hands of physicians and matrons summoned to verify what should never have been anyone's business but their own. The so-called virginity tests were among the cruelest bedroom rules forced on brides of high rank. Before a marriage could be declared valid, some courts required physical examination of the young woman's body to confirm she was pure. These tests, often performed by midwives or physicians, were invasive, humiliating, and deeply unreliable. A torn or absent hymen could mean accusations of scandal, annulment, or even political disaster. For a princess who had been sheltered her entire life, to suddenly be prodded and judged by strangers was nothing short of a nightmare. One infamous example unfolded in 17th century France, when doubts arose about the virginity of Princess Henrietta Maria before her marriage to Charles I of England. Whispers at the French court suggested she had been too free in her youth. To silence rumors, physicians were brought to examine her. Imagine a royal bride, barely out of adolescence, forced to endure a procedure that reduced her body to political evidence. The examination cleared her name, but it also set a chilling precedent that even a future queen's body could be inspected like a horse before sale. The horror didn't end with the wedding. Royal couples who struggled to produce heirs sometimes found themselves subjected to shocking levels of scrutiny. If a marriage went unconsummated, it wasn't just a private matter, it became a state crisis. Take the case of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. For years, their marriage remained unfulfilled. Eventually, physicians of both France and Austria debated publicly about the problem. Was the king impotent? Was the queen unwilling? Letters between Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and her daughter revealed the grotesque pressure. The Empress wrote in 1777 urging her daughter to be patient with her husband, while Austrian diplomats in Versailles reported on the royal couple's bedroom struggles, as though they were military campaigns. By the time Louis finally underwent a minor medical procedure that improved his performance, half of Europe had already dissected their intimacy. This obsession with consummation could turn the royal bed into a courtroom. In some annulment trials, witnesses testified about whether a marriage had truly been consummated. The most famous was the case of Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century. Their union produced no sons, and Louis argued that the marriage was invalid because they were too closely related. But rumors swirled that the marriage had never been fully consummated. Eleanor, humiliated by years of pressure and rumors, seized her freedom in annulment and went on to marry Henry II of England, becoming one of the most powerful queens in history. But the price of her liberation was a decade of public gossip about her most private nights. Even when marriages were consummated, fertility brought another layer of intrusion. Royal brides were expected to conceive quickly, and if they did not, blame often fell on them. Their diets were regulated, their bathing restricted, their movements controlled, all in the name of producing an heir. Physicians charted their cycles, noble women whispered advice, and midwives hovered like guards over their bodies. A queen's womb was less hers than it was the property of her dynasty. This surveillance could reach grotesque extremes. In some cases, queens were required to give birth publicly, or at least semi-publicly, with courtiers present to confirm that no substitution had taken place. The fear of switched infants ran so deep that the queen's suffering became a spectacle, her cries filling a chamber packed with witnesses. One can hardly imagine a greater invasion of privacy than giving birth, with ministers and nobles watching to ensure the child was truly hers. But perhaps the most chilling of all were the medical interventions performed without consent. In 16th and 17th century Spain, if a royal couple failed to produce heirs, physicians sometimes inspected both husband and wife, declaring one or the other defective. Queens, of course, bore the heavier burden. If their husbands were found impotent, sometimes marriages could be annulled on the grounds of malfunction, freeing the man to try again with another bride. For the woman, failure meant disgrace, exile, or confinement to a convent. The story of Catherine de' Medici illustrates this cruel reality. Married to Henry II of France in 1533, she failed to conceive for the first 10 years of her marriage. Physicians experimented with bizarre remedies, including prescribing potions and placing odd restrictions on her diet. Rumors spread that she was barren, and for years her position seemed doomed. Only later did it emerge that the king's own anatomy was partly to blame. Once he underwent medical treatment, Catherine conceived, and went on to bear 10 children. But for a decade, her reputation, her safety, and even her survival hung on her warm's performance. And so we see that for royal brides, the marriage bed was never their own. It was a political stage, a medical experiment, and a battlefield where their worth was measured by blood, heirs, and obedience. Their privacy was stripped away, their bodies dissected by rumor, law, and science alike. And this raises a chilling question. In such a world, where the queen's body was endlessly examined and her intimacy judged by outsiders, could any royal bride ever feel safe in her own skin? Or was her very identity consumed the moment she walked down the aisle? For a royal bride, failure was never just personal, it was political. When she could not produce heirs, or when rumors of her virginity, fidelity, or fertility circulated, she faced not just shame, but exile, annulment, or even death. The bedchamber was her battlefield, and losing meant losing everything. Consider the story of Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's ill-fated fourth wife. When Henry declared their marriage unconsummated in 1540, Anne's fate might have been grim. Instead, she accepted the annulment gracefully, and Henry rewarded her with the title, the king's beloved sister. But make no mistake, her survival depended on her compliance. Had she resisted, she could easily have met the fate of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, who in 1536 was accused of adultery and incest when she failed to produce a male heir. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, but they justified her execution. For Anne Boleyn, her bedroom performance, or lack of it, became a death sentence. The fates of queens across Europe echo with similar tragedies. In 16th century Spain, Joanna of Castile, known cruelly as Joanna the Mad, was confined to a convent after her husband's death, partly because her family believed she was too unstable to serve as queen. But behind the label of madness lay years of scrutiny, gossip, and pressure to perform her marital role. Her passion for her husband was turned into scandal, her grief into proof of insanity. She became a prisoner not because of her actions alone, but because her body and emotions failed to align with the expectations placed upon her. In Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, faced endless criticism of her marriages. When her first husband, Francis II of France, died young, Mary returned home to Scotland. Her second marriage, to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was scandalized by rumors of infidelity and political intrigue. When Darnley was murdered, suspicion fell upon Mary and her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell. Stripped of her crown, imprisoned, and eventually executed in 1587, Mary's intimate life became her undoing. Every choice in her bedroom reverberated in her throne room, and ultimately led to her downfall. The humiliation could be just as devastating as execution. When Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine annulled their marriage in 1152, the official reason was consanguinity, that they were too closely related. But gossip spread that the real issue was Eleanor's supposed failure to provide sons, and that Louis found her cold. Eleanor, a woman of fiery spirit, refused to accept this fate quietly. Within months, she married Henry of Anjou, the future Henry II of England, and went on to bear him 8 children. Her defiance turned personal humiliation into political triumph. But her story shows how a queen's worth was measured by her womb. Sometimes, the betrayal came from those closest to the bride. In the case of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, decades of loyalty and duty could not save her when she failed to give him a surviving male heir. After years of humiliating trials, Catherine was set aside, her marriage declared invalid. She was exiled from court, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. Catherine, once the proud Spanish princess who had crossed the sea to marry into England's throne, died in lonely isolation in 1536. Her failure in the bedroom had cost her crown, her status, and her peace. The cruelty of these rules extended even to women who had done everything right. Queens who produced heirs could still fall victim to suspicion. If their husbands strayed, or if politefactions sought to undermine them, accusations of adultery could destroy them. In Denmark, Queen Caroline Matilda was accused of an affair with a court physician, Johann Struensee. Whether true or not, the scandal led to her arrest and exile in 1772. Struensee was executed. Caroline lost her children, and the whispers of her bedroom sealed her fate. The punishments were not always so dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet, insidious, and lifelong. A queen who failed to meet expectations might be banished from the marital bed entirely, her husband taking mistresses openly while she remained trapped in ceremonial duty. Such was the case for Louis XV's queen, Marie Leicester, who bore him 10 children but eventually lost his interest. He turned instead to a string of mistresses, while she lived in the shadows of Versailles, reduced to a role of mere dignity. For a royal bride, success did not guarantee happiness, it only postponed irrelevance. Even beyond Europe, the rules were merciless. In Mughal India, royal wives and concubines were judged not only on their ability to bear sons, but on their ability to please the emperor. Failures could be cast aside into secluded quarters, never to be seen again. The pattern was universal. Women of royal blood were treated as vessels for dynasties, their desires erased beneath crowns. The tragic irony is that while queens and princesses suffered these humiliations, kings rarely faced the same standards. A king who failed to perform could blame his bride. A king who strayed faced only whispers. The double standard was baked into the very laws of succession. A queen's worth was her chastity and fertility. A king's worth was his lineage and power. And so, for centuries, royal brides lived under rules that transformed their most private moments into public trials. Their wedding nights could be annulled, their failures punished, their bodies scrutinized by strangers, their reputations torn apart by gossip. They were queens in name, but prisoners in practice. Which leaves us with a haunting thought. How many royal brides lay awake on their wedding night, trembling not from passion, but from fear? How many whispered silent prayers, not for love, but for survival. For centuries, the pattern seemed fixed. Royal brides were humiliated, judged, and discarded if they failed to meet the brutal standards of the bedroom. But every now and then, a queen refused to bow. Instead of being broken, she turned her confinement into a weapon, her humiliation into leverage, and her body, once seen as a prison, into a source of unexpected power. Take the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of the Middle Ages. After her annulment from Louis VII in 1152, she might have been cast aside, remembered only as a failed queen of France. But Eleanor was not a woman to vanish. Within weeks, she married Henry of Anjou, the fiery young duke who would become King Henry II of England. Far from a discarded bride, Eleanor became the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty, mother to Richard the Lionheart and King John. She had endured whispers of coldness, accusations of barrenness, and the humiliation of annulment, but she emerged stronger, shaping the politics of Europe for decades. Her story proves that a royal bride could reclaim her fate, even when her first marriage branded her a failure. Another remarkable example is Catherine de' Medici. For 10 years after her marriage to Henry II of France, she was unable to conceive, and her position seemed doomed. Gossip painted her as barren, her enemies schemed to replace her. But Catherine endured, and when medical intervention revealed that her husband's anatomy had been the true obstacle, she went on to bear 10 children. From near disgrace, she rose to become Queen Mother, ruling France as regent for her sons. Catherine turned her womb, once dismissed as useless, into the very foundation of a dynasty. In more modern times, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sissi, waged her own rebellion. Married at 16 to Emperor Franz Joseph, she was thrust into a rigid court that monitored her body, her pregnancies, her every movement. Though she fulfilled her duty by bearing children, Elizabeth resisted the suffocating rules of the Habsburg court. She withdrew from the palace, traveled extensively, and cultivated her own identity as a poet and icon. Her rebellion was quieter, less direct than Eleanor's or Catherine's, but it was still defiance, a refusal to be reduced to her role as dynastic womb. Her life was tragic, but in her rejection of the rules, she carved out a measure of freedom that many royal brides never knew. Sometimes defiance came not from queens themselves, but from the way history remembered them. Anne of Cleves, rejected by Henry VIII after a disastrous wedding night, could have been destroyed. Yet she accepted the annulment and reinvented herself as the king's beloved sister. Unlike Henry's other wives, Anne survived, and even thrived. She built a comfortable household, enjoyed independence, and outlived them all. Her compliance may have seemed submission at the time, but in hindsight, it was strategy. By yielding, she preserved her life and carved out a rare kind of freedom in a world that destroyed so many others. And then there were queens who resisted through sheer willpower. Catherine of Aragon, abandoned by Henry VIII after decades of marriage, refused to accept the annulment of her union. She insisted until her dying breath that she was Henry's true wife and England's true queen. Her defiance inspired loyalty across the kingdom, even as she was exiled and humiliated. Though she lost her crown, her steadfastness left a legacy that echoed in her daughter Mary, who would one day reign in her own right. Catherine's refusal to bend made her a symbol of dignity against cruelty. But perhaps the boldest defiance of all came from those queens who used scandal itself as power. Christina of Sweden, who reigned in the 17th century, refused marriage altogether. When pressed to wed and produce heirs, she abdicated her throne and declared she would not be ruled by a husband or a bedchamber. Christina lived her life as she chose, scandalizing Europe but earning her place as one of the few women in history to defy the bedroom rules outright. She gave up her throne, but in exchange, she kept her freedom. Even in smaller acts, defiance flickered. Queens who cultivated secret lovers, who wrote poetry about their frustrations, who whispered to confidants their longing for autonomy. All of these moments were rebellions, quiet but real. Each act chipped away at the system that treated them as little more than vessels for dynasties. And so we see that while many royal brides suffered, some managed to reclaim control, however limited. Some bent the rules until they broke. Some turned exile into independence, or disgrace into survival. Some wielded their children as proof of triumph, and a few, rare and bold, rejected the game altogether. But even in these victories, the system loomed. For every Eleanor or Catherine who rose from humiliation, there were countless unnamed brides who endured in silence, whose stories were never written down. The weight of the rules crushed more than it liberated. And it leaves us with a question. Were these acts of defiance exceptions to the rule? Or were they the first cracks in a system that would, eventually, collapse? By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe had entered an age of enlightenment and revolution. Science was reshaping medicine, political ideas were transforming monarchies, and the world itself was changing. But for royal brides, the ancient rules of the bedroom still clung stubbornly to their silken sheets. The rituals of public bedding, virginity tests, and stained sheets began to fade, but the expectations remained. A queen was still a womb, her worth measured by her fertility and her obedience. What had once been crude public ceremonies transformed into subtler, but no less invasive, forms of control. Take the story of Marie Antoinette once more. Though the public bedding ceremony was no longer practiced in full by the late 18th century, the scrutiny of her marriage was unrelenting. The French court demanded to know why the young queen had not conceived. Gossip spread through pamphlets, satirical cartoons mocked her, and foreign ambassadors sent reports home about her most intimate failures. It was as though the eyes of all Europe had climbed into her bed. Only after years of pressure, medical consultation, and intervention did she bear children, but by then her reputation had already been destroyed. Her womb had become a political battlefield long before the revolution would take her head. In Britain, similar pressures stretched into the 19th century. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, their union was celebrated as a love match, a rare blessing among dynastic marriages. But even Victoria was not free from expectation. Within the first year, she conceived, and by the end of her childbearing years, she had given birth to 9 children. Each pregnancy was treated as a triumph of the monarchy, each heir a reassurance that the dynasty was secure. Yet Victoria herself privately confessed to loathing the physical burdens of pregnancy and resented the endless cycle of childbirth. Her body was her kingdom's insurance, not her own. Across Europe, queens faced similar fates. In Russia, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Nicholas II, was tormented by her failure to produce a healthy male heir. After bearing 4 daughters, she finally gave birth to a son, Alexei, in 1904. But the boy was hemophiliac, his illness kept secret but feared throughout the empire. Alexandra was blamed for her failure, her desperation leading her into the arms of mystics like Rasputin. Her entire reign as empress was overshadowed by the politics of her womb. Her bedroom, like those of queens before her, had become the stage for a nation's destiny. Even in the 20th century, these pressures lingered. Consider Queen Elizabeth II's marriage to Prince Philip in 1947. By then, public bedding ceremonies were long gone, but the monarchy still watched anxiously for heirs. When Elizabeth gave birth to Prince Charles in 1948, it was seen as more than a personal joy. It was a stabilizing force for the monarchy in the aftermath of World War II. The eyes of the world remained fixed on her womb, just as they had on Marie Antoinette centuries earlier. And though science had advanced, the scrutiny of royal brides did not disappear. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, medical examinations of queens and princesses were still whispered about in European courts. Was the bride healthy enough to bear children? Was she fertile? These questions, though dressed in clinical language, carried the same invasive spirit as the virginity tests of the Middle Ages. The persistence of these expectations reveals a grim truth. The modernization of monarchies did not liberate women from their roles as dynastic vessels. Instead, the rituals simply shifted form. The public no longer crowded into the wedding chamber, but newspapers, ambassadors, and gossip columns took their place. The sheets were no longer inspected, but the belly of the queen was studied, photographed, and dissected by the press. And so, the horror of these rules endured. Royal brides continued to carry the burden of producing heirs, of proving their value in the most personal way possible. They smiled in portraits, waved from balconies, and carried crowns on their heads. But in private, they were weighed down by the same expectations that had crushed queens for centuries. Yet, as monarchies weakened and women gained new rights, cracks began to appear. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of love matches, of royal women who dared to demand more than duty. Victoria's descendants married not only for alliances, but for affection. And in doing so, they began to push back against the ancient rules of the bedroom. Still, the shadow remained. Even today, whispers about royal brides echo with centuries of tradition. From Kate Middleton to Meghan Markle, from Princess Diana to Queen Letizia of Spain, the press dissects their bodies, their pregnancies, their choices. Though the stained sheets and virginity tests are gone, the invasive curiosity persists. And this leaves us with a haunting realization. The rules may have softened, but they have never truly vanished. A royal bride is still, in the eyes of many, a vessel for the dynasty. Her wedding night may not be witnessed, but her body remains the stage upon which history is written. Which brings us to the final question. If the ghosts of these bedroom rules still linger in modern palaces, what does that tell us about the way power politics and patriarchy cling to the most private corners of our lives? Imagine them all together for a moment. Eleanor of Aquitaine, stripped of her dignity in one marriage only to seize power in the next. Catherine of Aragon, defending her honor before kings and priests, as though her wedding night decades earlier was still on trial. Anne Boleyn, executed when her womb failed to deliver a male heir. Marie Antoinette, mocked and dissected by an entire court for her struggles in the bedroom. Alexandra of Russia, clinging to mystics as the health of her only son threatened the stability of her empire. Different centuries, different kingdoms, but the same cruel truth. From medieval France to Victorian England, from the Habsburg palaces to the Kremlin, the rules were always the same. A royal bride was not her own. She was a body to be examined, a womb to be tested, a vessel for dynastic survival. Her desires, her privacy, her humanity, all were stripped away beneath the crushing weight of crowns and expectations. The bedroom, which for most couples is a sanctuary, was for these women a stage. Curtains drawn, courtiers whispering, physicians summoned, rumors spreading. Love, if it appeared at all, was a fragile flower struggling to grow in soil poisoned by duty. And yet, within that suffocating darkness, sparks of resistance flickered. Eleanor of Aquitaine defied annulment and built a dynasty of her own. Catherine de' Medici transformed a decade of humiliation into decades of power. Anne of Cleves accepted humiliation only to reinvent herself as one of the few wives of Henry VIII to live in peace. Christina of Sweden rejected the very rules themselves, abdicating her throne rather than be shackled to her husband's bed. Even in small ways, through whispered letters, secret poems, quiet rebellions, queens pushed back, daring to claim pieces of themselves in a world determined to consume them. But for most, survival meant submission. How many royal brides endured silently, their stories lost, their suffering buried beneath the gilded records of dynasties? How many laid awake on their wedding nights, trembling not with anticipation but with dread, knowing that their bodies were about to become public property? And the cruelest part of all is that these rules did not vanish with the past, they evolved. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the public bedding ceremonies were gone, the sheets no longer displayed, the virginity tests conducted less openly, but the pressure remained. Marie Antoinette still lived under the eyes of the court. Queen Victoria still bore the burden of 9 pregnancies. Empress Alexandra was still judged for failing to produce a healthy heir. Even into the 20th century, queens and princesses felt the sting of these old expectations. The world pretended it had changed, but the ghosts of the old rules lingered in every whisper, every rumor, every tabloid headline. Princess Diana's marriage in 1981 was no bedding ceremony, yet her virginity had been dissected by the press long before she walked down the aisle. The obsession with royal brides' bodies, their purity, their fertility, their ability to provide heirs, has never truly gone away. And that is the haunting legacy of the horrific bedroom rules. They remind us that even the most powerful crowns could not shield women from the most intimate invasions. That behind every coronation, every royal wedding, every glittering gown, there was a frightened young woman forced into a bed she did not control. But there is also another lesson. The resilience of these women, their defiance, their survival, reminds us of the strength it takes to endure systems designed to break you. They carved out spaces of power, sometimes grand, sometimes small, but always significant. Their lives were tragedies, yes, but also testaments. So, the next time you see a royal wedding, the carriages, the crowds, the glittering tiaras, remember the shadows beneath the jewels. Remember the queens who lay beneath silken sheets, their lives judged by stains and whispers. Remember that what seemed like fairy tales were often nightmares, gilded and hidden away. And ask yourself, what does it say about history and about us, that the most private part of a woman's life became the most public test of her worth? This has been Whispers of History. If you've stayed with us through this journey, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that peel back the velvet curtains of the past to reveal the truths that history tried to keep hidden. Until next time, sleep well. But remember, not every bed is made for love.